My name is Kevin Landy. I am a assistant professor of philosophy at York University and a member of the Center for Vision Research there. I'm organizer of this event along with Chaz Firestone. And my work is in the philosophy of vision science. In this area, philosophers try to answer basic questions about the nature of perception, mind, and then knowledge, both on the basis of the latest results in vision science, but also by carefully teasing out the core concepts, frameworks, and commitments that make the science of vision work. So in doing so, we consume a broad range of experimental research, but we also try to be familiar with the process, the people, and the institutions of the scientific work. So when philosophers and vision scientists get together, it's clear that the philosophers have a ton to benefit from. In turn, I'm told by certain experimentalists that they also have things to benefit from the philosophers. It seems that they can gather new context for the work, new insights for the research programs, inspiration for future research projects. I'll let Chaz talk more about that. But that's not to say that communication across fields is always smooth. So we're often driven by slightly different questions, concepts, and priorities. So the goal of phiVis is to expand that conversation and to give more of a chance to understand where we're all coming from. And last year, our first event, it was clear that there's a real desire for this sort of thing. We had over 300 attendees at the virtual workshop last year. It's clearly standing room remaining here. And it's just been an overwhelmingly positive response to the workshop. So I can't say how excited I am that we're doing this in person on the beach. So I'll hand it over to my co-organizer, Chaz.
Thank you, Kevin. My name is Chaz Firestone. I'm an assistant professor of psychological and brain sciences at Johns Hopkins. But I also teach and advise students in our philosophy department. And in fact, many members of our lab have graduate degrees in philosophy and explore questions at the intersection of those fields. And speaking for myself, at least, like having one foot in the door of philosophy has really helped me appreciate the care and attention to detail that philosophers bring to their engagement with the experimental literature. I think you could say that philosophers basically cultivate like deep, careful thinking as their intellectual superpower. And I know this not just like in ways that can benefit our own field, but in ways that have benefited like our own lab. The projects that we pursue in our lab have benefited from engagement with philosophers. And we're hoping that this is the kind of thing that we're going to create today. Now, at the same time, like Kevin said, it's true that our two disciplines differ in many ways. We don't always have the same vocabulary or background. And so part of our goal with this workshop is not only to actually have the interdisciplinary conversations, but also to like learn how to have them better, to learn how to make them more fun, to learn how to better understand each other. And so that's another goal of ours in this workshop. And of course, there's really just no better place to do that than the center of like the vision science universe, which of course is VSS. So we should get to it now. I'm going to turn things back over to Kevin, who's going to tell you about our study. Thanks, Charles.
We'll have 3 20-minute talks from philosophers of vision, and each talk is going to be followed by a brief discussion from a vision scientist. Unfortunately, Jacob Beck on the schedule couldn't be here, but we have Sam Clark, his co-author, who will be speaking. And after each round of comments from vision scientists, we'll have time for a question or two. We also have an amazing chair, Megan Peters, who is an assistant professor in cognitive science at UC Irvine, who runs this wonderfully interdisciplinary lab and research program herself, exploring the science of perceptual metacognition and conscious awareness. So Megan's going to be moderating questions, and after the final set of the final talk, we'll have a general discussion. And we also have a few tables set up at the demo night barbecue where we have wine. And we invite you all to continue the discussion over wine at the demo night barbecue.
Those tables should be on the deck, like not on the sandy part, but
on the
like
brick deck by the
next
pool.
to the pool part. Yeah.
All right, Megan.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you so much to Chaz and Kevin for inviting me to chair this really super amazing session. I'm really pleased and honored to be here with you all. So as Kevin mentioned, I'm Megan Peters. I'm at UC Irvine. I run an interdisciplinary group. We do perceptual metacognition, consciousness, neuroimaging in humans. And I am really excited for the talks today. So I'm not going to talk for a long time. I'm just going to say A reminder during the Q&A that we've got time for a couple questions from the audience. So please, especially trainees, like raise your hand and ask those questions. We'll have lots of time afterwards for discussion as well. And so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Sam Clark, who is a MindCore Research Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. And Sam is going to be telling us about seeing numbers. Sam, please. Just hit the play button and make it work. Can you do this or this?
Oh, yeah.
Flip that guy.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kevin and Chaz, for organizing this, and Stella for agreeing to comment on my paper. I think a lot of philosophers would kind of be nervous about presenting empirically focused work at VSS to, room of experts, but I guess I'm lucky enough to kind of feel like an imposter most of the time. So this isn't really that big.
The mic doesn't seem like it's on.
It's not
Yeah.
working. Oh,
It
no.
does say on, but
It's just not
Put it by your lapel.
you
like
want to
on
just
the
try this?
wheel.
Is this?
Yeah.
So it just needs to be closer. Okay.
And your top button.
Great. Okay, is that good?
Yes.
Great. Okay then. Yeah, so today what I want to talk about is, I think, a kind of orthodox view in developmental psychology, comparative psychology, and vision science, according to which humans and many non-human animals possess what Stan DeHaan calls a number sense, or what researchers more commonly refer to as an approximate number system. Now, evidence for this system is found in a wide range of creatures. These include fish, rats, pigeons, monkeys, human infants, even newborns, pre-numerate human children who haven't yet learned to count, human adults whose language lacks precise number words, like the word for number 7, and of course all of us. So cumulatively, this suggests that this approximate number system is really quite widespread in nature, that operates independently of natural language, and that it's probably innate in some substantive sense of the term. So it probably affords creatures with some innate capacity to represent numbers. But of course, this orthodox view isn't completely uncontroversial. And I suppose a particularly fundamental concern stems from the idea, or critics who question whether this system really is in the business of representing numbers. So on the one hand, various critics propose that what looks like genuine number cognition is in fact the result of mechanisms and processes that simply track and represent non-numerical confounds, things like surface area density rather than number itself. Or I think, perhaps more plausibly, that really the system is representing some primitive analog of number rather than number itself. And what I want to do in this talk is offer you some reasons why we should resist these kind of deflationary conclusions and think that the system really is in the business of representing numbers of a kind of really boring sort that we might discuss in a maths class. So I'm going to start by just introducing the approximate number system, saying a little bit about why we might think it exists, and then going to introduce what I think is the most prominent argument against the idea that this system represents numbers, an argument that Jake and I call the argument for imprecision. And I'm going to suggest it's a bad argument, we should just forget about it. I'm then going to sketch some positive reasons for thinking that the system really is representing numbers in the fullest sense of the term. And because this is VSS, I'm going to introduce or close by considering a worry that some people might have, which arises from the fact that the approximate number system often seems to operate perceptually. And there might seem to be something a little bit kooky in the idea that we could perceptually represent or see numbers. So I'll say a little bit about what that might amount to. Okay, so there's loads that I could say about the approximate number system. The thing that's going to be really important for the purposes of today's talk is that unlike other numerical systems that have been posited in humans and other animals, the approximate number system is distinctive in that its numerical discriminations conform to or approximate conformity to Weber's law. So unlike other numerical systems that have been posited in humans and other animals, the approximate number system's ability to discriminate two numerical quantities is predicted by the ratio between those rather than their absolute difference in number. So to illustrate this, we can consider a really beautiful study by Hilary Barth and colleagues from 2005. So in this study, preschoolers, young children who can't yet count properly, were presented with the following sequence of events. So they were shown a screen. Onto this screen would move a collection of dots. This we pointed out to the children. An occluder would slide across the screen, blocking these dots from view, and a second set of dots would move onto the screen. It's all pointed out to the children. At this point, the experimenters would ask the children, were there more blue dots in the first collection or more red dots in the second collection? And the result, which you guys have probably all anticipated, is that the children could do this despite not yet being able to count, but their performance was ratio sensitive. So they did better at saying whether there were more blue dots or more red dots when there was a 4:7 ratio of blue to red dots than when there was a 4:6 ratio. And they did better when there was a 4:6 ratio than when there was a 4:5 ratio. So their performance conformed to Weber's law in the way just sketched. Now, what I think is more interesting or surprising is that Barth and colleagues then ran a cross-modal version of the same experiment. So again, children were presented with a screen. Onto this would move a collection of dots, and a occluder would slide across the screen, blocking these from view, just like in the first experiment. But at this point, the experimenter would tell the children, okay, now you're going to hear a sequence of tones. Beep, 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 beep. At which point the experimenter would ask the children, were there more blue dots in the scene collection or more heard tones in the sequence of tones just heard? And the stunning result was that children were as accurate in this version of the task. They were as good in this cross-modal version of the task as in the vision-to-vision comparison task. Now, the reason why I think this is worth kind of jumping up and down about is that cross-modal studies of this sort, and there are many, this is just one neat example of it, naturally eliminate non-numerical confounds from the kinds of comparisons that subjects are making. In a visual-to-visual comparison task, you might have a kind of lingering worry that maybe the subjects were simply comparing the surface area of the dots or the density of the arrays. But it doesn't look like the heard tones had any of these properties. So the fact that subjects can make these cross-modal comparisons provides really strong evidence, I think, that subjects are able to abstract away from these low-level confounds and to actually compare numbers or numerical quantities more generally. Now, despite evidence of this sort, I've already alluded to the fact that not everyone is convinced that the approximate number system really represents numbers. And I think the most prominent source of skepticism, the most prominent argument against this suggestion, is this argument that Jake and I call the argument for imprecision. Now, this argument pops up all over the literature, but in its generic form, the argument goes as follows. Critics begin by noting that the approximate number system is imprecise. So as we've seen, its ability to discriminate two numerical quantities is predicted by the ratio between those. So in this sense, the system seems to treat 4 and 5 as more different than 9 and 10. So it's imprecise in some way or another. But of course, numbers themselves seem to be essentially precise. Each natural number is exactly one more than its predecessor. And so the argument goes, the approximate number system isn't really representing numbers. Now, I think this is a bad argument for a number of reasons, but before I kind of launch into problems with it, I want to just introduce a couple of places. There are many, but I'm just going to introduce a couple of places where I think this pops up in the literature. So one place where it seems to pop up is in Susan Carey's, incredible book, The Origin of Concepts. I love this book, but she does introduce this bad argument. So she seems to introduce this argument when she claims analog magnitude representations, by which she means approximate number representations, are not powerful enough to represent the natural numbers. Why aren't they powerful enough to do this? Because they do not provide exact representations of number, and they obscure the successor function, which is constitutive of number. So here Carey is emphasizing the fact that the approximate number system is imprecision, obscures the successor relation, the fact that each natural number is just one more than its predecessor, and taking this to show that the system can't really be representing natural numbers. I think even more strident in this regard would be Rafael Nunes. So in a fairly recent by philosophical standards, maybe not by scientific standards, Nunes writes, a basic competence involving, say, the number 8 should require that the quantity is treated as being categorically different from 7 and not merely treated as often or highly likely to be different from it. On this basis, he concludes the quantity-related capacities observed in infants and non-human animals are not about numbers, but are about quantity, and therefore should not qualify as numerical. He proposes to refer to these biologically endowed capacities as quantical in contrast to numerical. So here Nunes takes the imprecision of the approximate number system to show that it's not even representing anything numerical at all. It's representing something quantical, whatever that actually is. Now, the problem with all of this is that the argument for imprecision that these theorists are relying on here is just logically invalid. So the mere fact that the approximate number system is imprecise, coupled with the fact that numbers themselves are essentially precise, fails to imply that the approximate number system wouldn't be representing numbers in the fullest sense of the term. And this is for the simple fact that there's nothing puzzling in the idea that a precise quantity might be represented imprecisely. And I think this is just kind of obvious when it comes to non-numerical constants, or non-numerical magnitudes. So non-numerical magnitudes like weight and height are also precise. There's a fact of the matter about exactly how heavy someone is or exactly how tall they are. But while we can purport to precisely represent these precise magnitudes, as when I say someone is exactly 240 pounds or 175 centimeters tall, I can also represent these precise magnitudes imprecisely by saying that man is about as heavy as an NFL linebacker or a little shorter than a doorway. In both cases, I'm referring to the same magnitude type. What differs is just how precisely I'm purporting to represent this. And what's true of non-numerical magnitudes seems to be true of numbers and numerical magnitudes as well. So while numbers themselves might be essentially precise, it seems like I can represent these precise magnitudes precisely, as when I say there are exactly 6 coins in my pocket or exactly a dozen eggs in my fridge. But I can also represent them imprecisely, as when I say there are approximately 6 coins in my pocket or a few eggs in the fridge. In both cases, I'm referring to the number of objects. What differs is just how precisely I'm purporting to represent this. Now, given this, you might be wondering why so many theorists seem to rely on or endorse this argument for imprecision. And the answer that Jake and I suggest is that they're tacitly assuming something like the following sensitivity principle. They're assuming something like the following. If some entity X has some property Y essentially, then representing X requires being sensitive to that essential property Y. Now, notice that if this sensitivity principle were true, it would fix the argument for imprecision. It would enable us to conclude that the approximate number system isn't representing numbers from the fact that the approximate number system is imprecise, coupled with the fact that numbers themselves are, by their very nature, essentially precise. But as is kind of familiar in the philosophical literature, this sensitivity principle is just false. So notice that gold is essentially the element with the atomic number of 79. But in order to think how much you'd like a gold watch, you don't need to know anything about atomic numbers. You needn't even be sensitive to the difference between gold and fool's gold. So lots of people who are just ignorant of chemistry and metallurgy nevertheless think about and thereby represent gold. And what's true of thought also seems to be true of perception. So it seems to be an essential feature of many of the magnitudes that we represent perceptually that these are dense. So in between any two distances, lengths, durations, there always seems to be a third. But while our perceptual system is sensitive to and able to represent these continuous and dense magnitudes, it has a limited resolution that prevents it from being sensitive to their density. So for instance, in representing motion, the visual system seems to rely on Reichardt detectors, which aren't sensitive to the difference between discrete and continuous changes in position. So this is why a string of Christmas lights that turn on in quick succession give rise to the Phi phenomenon, illusion of motion. So in short, I think the sensitivity principle just needs to be rejected. And as a result, proponents of this argument for imprecision owe us some as yet unstated reason why a sensitivity to the precise nature of numbers should in some way be constitutive of the approximate number system, genuinely representing numbers. And while there's a bunch more that could be said here, I kind of struggle to see what a plausible reformulation of this principle is going to look like. So let's just put the argument for imprecision to one side. Now, at this point, you might think, fine, perhaps the approximate number system wouldn't need to be sensitive to the precise nature of numbers in order to literally represent these. But you might still be wondering whether we really have good reason to think that the system is in the business of representing numbers of a sort that we might discuss in a maths class. Well, what I want to suggest now is that I think we do have a few good reasons to think this. For one thing, the approximate number system does seem to be sensitive to certain properties that are typically considered to be distinctive of numbers. So for one thing, it seems to be sensitive to the fact that numbers, the things it's representing, have a higher order character that other magnitudes lack. So this is a kind of technical suggestion, but the basic idea is, I think, quite simple. It's that numbers seem to be different from other magnitudes in that they can only be assigned relative to some criterion for individuating the entities that are being counted. So as Frege famously observed, the question, how many boots are in your closet, seems to be ill-posed. In order to answer this question, we need to decide whether we're counting individual boots, pairs of boots, types of boots, and so forth. This is going to affect the number that we ascribe to the collection. By contrast, if we want to know how much the boots in the closet weigh, there's nothing we need to do once we've rounded up the set of boots. We can just toss it on the scales and read off the answer. It doesn't make a blind bit of difference whether we think of the shoes as a collection of individual shoes, pairs of shoes, and so forth. That's not going to affect the weight we assign to the collection. So in this way, numbers have seemed to have a higher order character that non-numerical magnitudes lack. Now, the reason why I think this is worth noting is that whether or not researchers always realize it, when people study the approximate number system, they're in the business of studying a system which tracks and represents entities or magnitudes with a higher order character of precisely this sort. So to see this, we can consider a really cool experimental paradigm that was pioneered by Steve Frankenary and colleagues in 2009. So in this experiment, subjects were asked to discriminate between two arrays containing circles and thin lines to say which one had more. Now they were told to just ignore the thin lines entirely as best they could. In spite of these instructions, it was found that when the thin lines connected two circles, effectively turning pairs of circles into single dumbbell-shaped objects, subjects systematically underestimated the number of items in the array. And meanwhile, introducing even just a very small break in the lines significantly reduced this effect. Now, in appreciating this, I think we're able to see that when the approximate number system enumerates collections, it really is taking a stand on how the entities in the collection are being individuated. And it's enabling this to affect the numerical quantities it ascribes to the set. So in this way, it's not just tracking a first order quantity like weight or surface area. It seems to be tracking magnitudes with a higher order character, which seems to be tantamount to saying that it's in the business of tracking and representing some kind of number. Now, just to kind of like sum up, we've now kind of amassed a bunch of considerations that speak in favor of the orthodox view that the approximate number system really is representing numbers. So we've seen that the most prominent argument against this suggestion is unsound. This was the argument for imprecision. It doesn't seem to be a good argument. It doesn't seem to work. So we should just forget about it. Secondly, we've seen that studies do seem to rule out confound-based explanations for approximate number system performance. So we saw this in the really nice study by Hilary Barth and colleagues at the beginning of the talk, where they showed that preschoolers could perform cross-modal number comparisons. And finally, we've seen that the approximate number system seems to be sensitive to the higher order character of numbers, where this higher order character seems to be distinctive of numbers. It doesn't seem to be found in other magnitude types. So I think all of this is good news for the orthodox view that the approximate number system is really in the business of representing numbers of a genuine sort. But just to close, and because this is VSS and I thought I should make it more explicitly vision focused, you might have a kind of worry, right? And this worry arises because the approximate number system often seems to operate perceptually. So I think this is clearest in the work of people like David Burr and colleagues who have shown many times over that you get spatiotopic adaptation effects to number. Now, this might seem to give rise to a worry, or at least a concern with this hypothesis, because it might seem kind of weird to think that we're able to perceptually represent numbers, these things that aren't located in space and time, these things that can't really reflect light into our eyes. But I think this is a place where philosophical reflection might help to kind of soothe these worries and clarify how the thesis is best understood. So to clarify, philosophers interested in perception standardly take perceptual states to have an object property structure. So our perceptual states refer to objects which are concrete particulars out there in the world, and then they attribute properties to them. So for instance, in seeing the apple as red, my visual state refers to a spatially located object, the apple, and attributes to it the property redness. And what's nice about this is that it enables us to see how my perception of the apple as red and my perception of the barn door as red might have something in common, even though they involve completely different objects. Now, the point to note is that in suggesting that the approximate number system perceptually represents number, we should say the same thing. So the hypothesis is not best understood as the idea that we perceive the object, the abstract object 7 on its own, as it were. It's rather that we perceive collections as being, say, 7 in number. So in seeing this collection of dots as 7 in number, my visual state refers to this concrete plurality up there on the screen, and it attributes to it the property of being 7 in number. So it's not like numbers need to be these things in the physical world that we can bump into and that reflect light into our eyes. Now, that's basically all I was going to say. In sum, I think we have a bunch of reasons to think that the approximate number system represents number. I'm now seeing that I have a very out-of-date final slide. But yeah, if you would like to read more about this, or maybe just avoid this, you could look up or avoid my target article with Jake Beck, the number sense represents rational numbers. And yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. That was great. So now we will move on to comments from Stella Laverco.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you, Kevin and Chaz, for inviting me to comment on Sam and Jake. That's very interesting work. I'm going to focus my comments on 2 claims. The first main claim, as articulated by Sam, is that the ANS is in fact a real thing, which is to say that number as a percept is a genuine dimension of experience. It's not simply a byproduct of the non-numerical magnitudes that exist in the physical environment. It's not computed from those magnitudes. It's in and of itself a perceived experience. The second claim, which Sam was a little less explicit about, but proponents of the orthodox view are often very explicit about, is that perceived number is fully abstract. Right, so it's abstracted away from the sensory modality, as Sam suggested, but within a sensory modality, it's also fully abstracted away from the non-numerical magnitudes that co-occur with it, which is to say that it's independent of those non-numerical magnitudes, at least within perception. So you might be wondering at this point, are these really 2 distinct claims? If you buy into the idea that number is a genuine dimension, then doesn't it logically follow that perceived number would be independent and abstracted from the non-numerical magnitudes? So what I'm going to suggest in a little bit, and I'll present some research consistent with this idea, is that even though we can have a genuine dimension of perceived number, it may not be fully abstracted away from the co-occurring non-numerical magnitudes in the input. Okay. So I'm going to start with a few examples that support the main claim that number is a genuine dimension. So one type of example comes from human infants who detect changes in number even when the non-numerical magnitudes are variable. So here's an example of a 6-month-old infant in what we call a change detection paradigm. It begins with an attention getter that orients the baby centrally. There are two dynamic visual streams. On the left, the stream is alternating between numerosity. So you've got displays of 10 and 20, 10 and 20. On the right displays, you've got number being held constant. So the dots are always 10. Now, importantly, in both streams, the non-numerical magnitudes are varying similarly so that the dots are varying in size, total surface area, density, convex hull, and so on. And on this particular trial of this task, what you can see is that the infant spends most of his time looking at the numerically changing stream, and he seems quite proud of himself for recognizing that difference, which wouldn't be the case if all you were doing was computing the non-numerical magnitudes, right, that don't discriminate the displays. It's the numerically changing stream that draws your attention, captures your attention in this paradigm. Okay. So here's some data from a study that tested 6-month-olds in this paradigm. And what you can see is that looking time towards the numerically changing stream increases monotonically with the ratio, consistent with Weber's law, as Sam mentioned. And again, suggesting that the infants are in fact encoding number, given that the non-numerical magnitudes wouldn't allow you to discriminate between those two streams. There's some other evidence from neuroimaging that suggests that there's a sensitivity to number in early visual cortex. So there are two recent studies, one using EEG, the other using fMRI, both of which show that you could decode numerosity in EVC, and that the decoding, the sensitivity tracks within ratio of the numerical differences. Now, importantly, in these studies, you also find that you can decode non-numerical magnitudes like the area, the density. And so you might be asking, well, how do we know that it's number that's being computed per se? Maybe the non-numerical magnitudes are being processed later downstream and integrated and then feeding back into EVC. And this is what proponents of the non-orthodox view would argue. So I think one reason to think that that's not the case comes from some work by Lucero and colleagues who showed that steady state visual evoked potentials were tracking with the numerical differences, even when those stimuli were backward masked, right, which is supposed to disrupt the feedback. And even when, and even when the participants were not conscious of those differences. So again, suggesting that maybe what we really got here is the encoding of non-numerical information bottom up and not simply the result of feedback from integration of the non-numerical magnitudes. So this brings me to the second claim, which is that you can have a genuine dimension and you may or may not have independence, but the classic view, the orthodox view as exemplified by this sort of cartoon model, is that you've got sensory input within the stimulus, you've got information about number, size, area, and so on. But when we're perceiving and representing number, what we're doing is we're normalizing over the non-numerical magnitudes to compute a sort of location map that we can then sum over to get a representation of number per se, devoid of the non-numerical magnitudes. So it'll be approximate, but it's going to be devoid of those non-numerical magnitudes. So what was always really awesome about this perspective is that perceived number is being treated much like conceptual number, right? Which is to say that when we see numbers, we're seeing them in a way that's similar to having a symbolic representation for the word 5 or the Arabic digit 5, devoid of those non-numerical perceptual features. I think reason to believe that this may not be the case comes from some really cool work recently that made clever use of the Mueller-Lyer illusion, where they simply replaced the solid line in between the arrows that were either inward or outward with the individual dots. And what you find is that people overestimate the numerical value for the dots that are bounded by the outward arrows. And you find these effects when you do discrimination and when you do estimation tasks. And that's important because on a discrimination task, you might still argue that those effects are post-perception done at the decision stage and a response compatibility effect of sorts. Another experiment used the Ebbinghaus illusion that also showed that if you replace the internal dot with these arrays of dots, that you overestimate, or sorry, well, you overestimate the numerosity when it's bounded by the small circles compared to the large circles, both on discrimination and estimation, suggesting that these interactions are happening within perception. I'll wrap up. But you still might be asking, what does it mean to have these interactions within perception? So one possibility that we recently tested in my lab is that maybe you have a more holistic perception of numerical and non-numerical magnitudes, more akin to this classic distinction between separable and integral dimensions. So the idea here is that maybe number and the co-occurring magnitudes are more like an integral representation, like brightness and saturation, as in contrast to separable dimensions like shape and color. So we did a bunch of experiments with a former student of mine, Lauren Aulette. We used categorization tasks, matched to sample. We used different stimulus spaces. And in all of these cases, what we find is that the psychological similarity between number and total surface area, in this case, as the stand-in for the non-numerical magnitude, is best quantified by Euclidean distance as opposed to a city block distance, which suggests that these are integral dimensions of magnitude, which is to say that maybe instead of these representations of number that are devoid of the non-numerical magnitudes, we may have a more multi-dimensional representation of number and the co-occurring magnitudes like area that we see when we're representing the visual stimulus input. Thank you.
Thanks, that was great. Actually, Stella, if you want to stay up here, we're going to have time for a few quick questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, yes.
So
Speak loudly.
I did have one thought in this, and I think,
Yeah, do you want to?
I can just stand up. But one thought I had was, I went more on the quantity and magnitude side of things, largely because those are relevant dimensions to us as living organisms. And so you need to know the magnitude of something in order to interact with it properly. I guess the question I have about the number is, what like evolutionary adaptive use would there be for a number abstracted away from what it's represented? Because 8 grapes is enough for me, 8 apples I can share with you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I guess, all right, thanks. So, I mean, I guess, I kind of agree that it's not all that easy to come up with, you know, a concrete, couldn't get around this evolutionary story for why number would need to be represented. You know, I could come up with a bunch, you know, it's kind of a standard thing that papers on the ANS, they start with this like paragraph where you say, you know, of course, it's of great adaptive value to be able to keep track of the number of food items in your stash when you're a parent or whatever. And, you know, this is super important. But I mean, it's not really all that obvious, right? It's the volume of food that's most important. I mean, one suspicion that I have is, or, you know, maybe assumption in all of this critique of the need for number is this assumption that it must be easier to track other quantities. I mean, it could, you know, the standard assumption is that you might just want to, you know, track non-numerical stuff instead of number, or use non-numerical stuff as a proxy for number. But I mean, I think it might just be possible that, you know, the visual system's already segmenting the world into objects. It's actually just computationally much easier to keep track of the number of items and use that as a proxy for volume in a lot of cases. You know, that might be why there's some, I mean, I think Stella would probably push back a little bit on this, but like some evidence that, you know, that number might be a kind of, it might be privileged in some respect, that we're more sensitive to number in a lot of context than to non-numerical stuff. But yeah, that's to say, I don't really know what the evolution, I mean, I don't really think anyone does. I'm very dubious of evolutionary justice stories.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, we have time for one more quick question, I think. So right here in the front in the black mask. Yeah.
Okay. I wondered if we could have some rapprochement between the two of you, if you'll permit a little rhetorical inelegance. I wonder if numbers are I love the integral sort of stuff, harkening back to Wendell Garner. I wonder if they are always integrally integral. In the sense that one way to just sort of accommodate what both of you are saying is you can distinguish between the question of can we represent number per se, divorced from all of the other things, versus do we typically often represent them separately from all these things? And the answer could be yes in the first case, but no in the second case. Right? I mean, it could be that we often, when it's visual, represent things as a sort of like integral holistic representation. But when they're divorced, as in the Hilary Barth experiment or in David Burr's like cross-modal adaptation that's spatially specific to number, then you're actually representing, you can represent number separately from all these properties, and then you both win.
Oh, I like ending on that note. But let me just push back for 1 second, which is, even though I would argue that within perception, these numerical and non-numerical magnitudes that are co-occurring are being represented holistically. At some point, I may have to make a decision, right, to go with the 5 apples, regardless of their sizes or whatever, maybe my kid really likes apples, right? So I've just got to get the apples. So I think at some point, you have to be able to access within that holistic representation number per se. So how might we do that? I think one possibility that we're at least trying to test in my lab is maybe that is happening at a decision stage, post-perception, a sort of top-down intentional thing whereby you might be able to kind of switch your decision boundary within that multidimensional space and say, now I'm going to sort of use number. So it's, in that sense, it might be sort of separable or independent, but maybe in a more functional sort of way, not, structurally or even, within perception, but I think it's an open question. In the case of Hilary Barth, I would argue that within the visual space, numbers probably still being coded with the non-numerical magnitudes. Within the auditory space, you've got it being coded with the non-numerical magnitudes in that auditory space. But the task is to judge number. So I can use my attentional system to selectively pull out number from the visual input and from the auditory input. But a lot of this needs empirical basis and follow-up.
I think we gotta move on.
Okay.
Sorry, folks.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's thank our 2 speakers. Next, we're going to hear from Nico Orlandi, who will talk about, who's a professor of philosophy at UC Santa Cruz. Sorry, forgot to say that. And Nico's going to tell us about Bayesian probabilities and perception, critical analysis.
Okay,
Take that microphone. Great.
can you all hear me?
Can you use the mic?
Is it on?
Like a rock star? I'll do it. I'm a rock star. Hi, hi
It's
everyone.
not on.
It's not on.
Great.
Now, can you hear me?
It's on.
It takes
It's
a
on.
second. Hello.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here, Charles and Kevin. In a way, this is going to be a good follow-up to the talk that just happened, because we're asking a similar question in some ways, namely what it would be like for the perceptual system to represent probabilities. This is a topic of great interest recently, at least in philosophy. I say we because much of this paper has been written in collaboration with my colleague at UC Berkeley, Jeff Lee, whose beautiful face you'll see in the last slide today. I have to say, I do feel particularly honored to be here because Jeff and I basically just, for this project, sat down and tried to understand some models of perceptual processing from neuroscience, and we really are not sure that we got them right at all. So it's possible that the whole thing is wrong, but it's not. It's actually all right. Okay. So the guiding question is roughly, what would it be for a perceptual system to represent probabilities? Impressionist paintings are particularly good to introduce the topic because they give you a sense at the conscious level of, a sense of uncertainty as to what's out there. Is that Jacques walking towards you, maybe to a probability of 0.6 or something like that. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, though, I'll focus primarily on subconscious states. So the states that are hypothesized to occur in perceptual processing, but that are not available to your conscious experience, or not necessarily available. They can become available, I suppose. Okay, so that's the guiding question. And our main goal as we engage in this project was just to offer an account of what probabilistic representations would be like were they to exist. We don't actually take a stance on whether they do exist, partly because we think, as we will see, that the debate is at least in part empirical. So we have to rely on the scientists to do all the work there, which we'll do gladly. But what we were interested in doing is sort of like provide a view that was compatible, at least, or that meshed well with models of perceptual processing. Okay. Now, for today's talk, I'll also have the side goal of giving some insight on how realistically we should take the models that I'm gonna go over. And this is a question that philosophers tend to be really interested in, how whether we should take the models to speak at what Mark called the algorithmic level of description, or just rather at the more general computational level. I don't know if many of you are acquainted with these distinctions, but I'll give a sketch of what this all means later. Okay, so just to introduce our view right away, we think that a plausible way of understanding probabilistic representation is as an analog, as opposed to digital, an analog state that systematically indicates probabilities, where the encoded probabilities are appropriately used or exploited by a system. And we think that current theories of perceptual processing that are Bayesian postulate such analog states. The theories that we looked at are signal detection theory, probabilistic population codes, and sampling. Sampling in particular is considered, at least in philosophy, as one plausible way of understanding how probabilities could be encoded in the perceptual system. Okay, so notice our view is kind of specific. We are making a specific claim about the vehicle of representations, that they are to be analog. So just to explain a bit what that means, analog representations are taken to be vehicle magnitudes whose function is to stand in for a target magnitude, usually in the environment, and whose interpretation involves a similarity preserving mapping function from the target magnitude onto the vehicle. The similarity doesn't have to be linear, but in the examples I'll give, it's linear. I'll give you examples with a linear similarity just for simplicity. And we also stress the importance of the use of the probabilistic information by the system, and we'll see why. Roughly, it's because if we don't appeal to the use of the probabilistic state, then we end up with a notion of probabilistic representation that is too thin in some sense. It's something that plants can have or something like that. Okay, so just to give an example, suppose you have a neural firing rate that correlates with the intensity of an odor from a food source. The more intense the odor, the higher the firing rate. So that's, in this case, the similarity is linear. And the firing rate is used by an animal to avoid or pursue the food source in a way that signals that the animal is actually sensitive to the varying intensity of the odor. That's a rough idea, okay, of what I mean by what we mean by magnitudes, sort of mirroring some magnitude in the environment. Okay, we basically just transferred this idea to probabilities, essentially. So now you have a vehicle magnitude that indicates the probability or probabilities of a hypothesis or set of hypotheses. And again, the magnitude is mirroring the probabilities in this case, okay? So suppose that now we have a neural firing rate that correlates with the probability that a food source is poisonous. The more probable the poison, the higher the firing rate. This is a toy example. I don't know that this exists in the brain, but hey, you know, we're good at hypothesizing. or imagining things. Okay, so in this case, again, there's a similarity and a linear correspondence between the probability, increasing probability and the increasing firing rate, okay? Now, our claim is that analog representations understood this way are actually present in signal detection theory, probabilistic population codes, and sampling, which are these three models that we tried to understand as we were writing this project. There's actually, I have to say, a lot of variation in how the models are presented. But in order to make them interesting and also understandable to an audience of non-neuroscientists, we worked with a toy example, okay? So this is gonna be the highlight of the slides. Philosophers are not good at making fancy slides, but the next 3 slides are the highlight of our paper and of the whole presentation, okay? So suppose that instead of thinking in terms of neurons, you're thinking in terms of windmills, okay? And you have a windmill that obviously turns at a certain speed when wind is present, okay? And so in this case, suppose that you're interested in figuring out whether the probability of wind coming from the west, okay, of western, or the probability of western wind. So the idea is to think of the speed of the windmill as representing the probability of westerly wind. So that magnitude co-varies with the probability of wind from the west. In signal detection theory, as we understand it, suppose that you have just one windmill and you face it west, and then there's wind and there's a certain speed of spinning of the windmill. And from that signal, you're able to sort of calculate the probability of westerly wind. Now notice that we picked this example because windmills can also spin due to noise, due to factors other than, or fail to spin due to noise, right? Due to factors other than the wind, okay? So in signal detection theory, there is presumably a sensory stage where you just have the signal, the speed of spinning, and then the decision stage where we imagine a Bayesian observer who looks at the spinning of the windmill and presumably knows information about the likelihood of spinning given wind present or wind absent, and then makes a decision based on a criterion as to whether there is wind from the west or not. The decision presumably takes into account some utilities. Okay, I see some nodding, so it means that we aren't completely off here. Now we understand probabilistic population codes as basically a much more complex version of this, where you add a bunch of windmills now, and you use every windmill as not just evidence, and so every reading of speed, not just evidence for one hypothesis, westerly wind, but as evidence for all the hypotheses about possible wind directions, okay? So you have probabilities not only of, so you have measures, not only of how probable westerly wind is, but also how probable easterly wind is and southeasterly wind is, et cetera, okay? So that's the idea. And again, like in signal detection theory, there's supposed to be a sensory stage where you just have the signals, and then a decision stage where you imagine a Bayesian observer who looks at the windmills and armed with likelihoods, and also some assumptions about the kind of noise involved in these models. Armed with that information, sort of calculates the probability of the different wind directions. In this case, there are some assumptions made about noise, otherwise the computations would be too complicated. That's our understanding of the models, okay? But in this case, it seems like you have a lot more information about all possible wind directions. That's very simplified. Then we move on to sampling. And in sampling, the way we understand them is an even more complex situation where basically you are trying to represent the posterior probability of wind present by literally setting things up so that you have a signal that mirrors that probability directly. So you put a bunch of windmills in different wind directions, and then you sample in a similar fashion to how you would do when you take peoples out of an urn to decide the ratio of black to white peoples inside, right? You basically just set up a bunch of windmills, set up in facing different directions, and then those that are over a certain threshold, you take into account, and then you literally count how many of them are turning at that threshold, and that should give you a literal representation of the posterior probability. So if the posterior probability of wind from the west is 80%, you should have literally, in this example, 8 out of 10 westernly faced windmills that turn over a certain threshold. This is just one possible sampling model. We found many of them that where the setup of the windmills is done differently, and they're also diachronic. So over time, in particle filters, for example, the windmills are turned in their direction where you hypothesize the wind is from, given previous readings, etc. But anyway, you know all of that, so I won't bother you with that. Okay, so the idea is now that, of course, we take all of this as analogous to what happens in brain. So in the neural case, neurons and their activation strands are analogous to the windmill and the speed at which it turns. Instead of thinking of a neuron as tuned to the presence of wind, we can think of a neuron as tuned to the presence of a certain element in the environment. The signal is a neural firing rate, or functionally analogous quantity. And the continuously variable strength of the signal function to indicate the probability that something is present. In both signal detection theory and probabilistic population code, there is also a decision stage where the decision is based on calculation of utilities. In sampling models, we didn't find as much of a decision stage because the samples are supposed to give you a direct mirroring of the posterior probabilities. But that's our reading of the models. Okay, now let's move on. This is all right. And now we move on a little bit to talk about the sort of critical analysis part of the talk, where we ask, if this is a good interpretation of the models, is this to be taken literally? What are some of the issues that arise when we think of probabilistic representations this way? So a very common criticism of these types of models is that they're merely metaphorical. So the common complaint is, look, although these models can be used to set a benchmark, so to give you a description of how a fully rational system would solve a given perceptual problem, they do not actually describe what the perceptual system does in any literal sense. And you can get sort of the gist of this just thinking about, the metaphor of windmills. You would have to have somebody, a person observing the windmills and then calculating the probabilities. Oh, we're already at 5 minutes. Okay, so this is a common concern, so I won't dwell on it too much. You can, similarly, you could think, look, I can use a bunch of very complicated math to describe the planets. It doesn't mean that the planets calculate. Or I could use a bunch of complicated math to describe plants. Doesn't mean that plants calculate. The worry transfers to the case of probabilistic representations, right? Are there really probabilistic representations, or are there merely states that in some sense track probabilities, but states that track probabilities are super common in the environment. They're everywhere in the environment. The asphalt on the street tracks the today's temperature, but we don't take the asphalt to be a representation of anything. Okay, so that's the one worry. Now, we think that actually the models are kind of careful, we found, in sort of like addressing this worry, at least partially. And so we've often found that they do stress the importance of pointing not just to the fact that neurons might carry information about probabilities, but that information is used in the system in making computations, in performing operations, okay? And so we think that that actually is a good making feature of the models that makes them plausible. So for example, in probabilistic population codes, right, you can calculate, or if we understand them correctly, you can calculate the log likelihood of a given wind direction or of a given hypothesis as a fixed linear combination of the different speeds of the different windmill speeds in our windmill example. It seems like adding and subtracting firing rates in probabilistic population codes stands for implementable analog computations where you can derive likelihoods and log likelihoods from the firing rates. So we think that is partly why we think our proposal is plausible from an empirical point of view. Now, that having been said, I say, here I want to repeat something that is sometimes pointed out when it comes to Bayesian models, that in assessing the models, it would be good to always have a comparison to an alternative model that could explain the operations, that could perhaps explain the operations just as well. And another dimension that we feel like we should pay attention to is the fact that within a given model, there's always the possibility, there's always this ambiguity that we should be able to sort of take care of, or we should be able to disambiguate in some sense. So when it comes to a vehicle magnitude, right, there's always this ambiguity where the magnitude could stand for a probability, but it could also stand for just a magnitude in the environment. So this is a bit of the same problem as understanding whether a certain representation is about numbers or about a magnitude that is a counterpart of numbers. This is an analogous problem. Are the internal states tracking probabilities, or are they tracking intensity of an order, which is a magnitude that presumably exists? Okay, so those are the things to look out for. But then after that, we do think that the debate is mostly empirical. It sort of kind of trades on what model best explains what the perceptual system does. I'll end with two more worries that came up as we were writing this paper. One has to do with underdetermination. So if our interpretation of the models is correct, then it seems like the models are not really useful to solving underdetermination, at least not in any substantive sense. But they're often advertised as motivated by the need to solve underdetermination. So underdetermination can be described in various ways, but in perception is generally the idea that despite noisy and underdetermined sensory stimulation, that stimulation is compatible with a number of distal causes, but we don't usually see a number of distal causes. We just see one thing, even though the light that thing projects is underdetermined, it's compatible with other distal causes. Okay, and this type of underdetermination is sometimes cited as a reason to accept Bayesian models, because after all, Bayesian decision theory is a theory about what to do in conditions of uncertainty, and underdetermination is a condition of uncertainty. But if we understand the models correctly, then the models don't really solve underdetermination, because they already presume that we know what the neurons are tuned to, what things in the environment the neurons are tuned to. In our windmill example, we start out already knowing what it is, wind direction the windmills are facing. And so in a sense, the underdetermination is very much restricted by this initial setup, right? And the worry here is that the more we realize that there's less underdetermination than you thought, the more you might think you don't need a Bayesian framework, because you don't need to sort of decide on what's out there given very indeterminate evidence. Okay, that's one final point. There's also an issue which is exactly analogous to the issue of numbers, which is notice that there is a bit of a disanalogy between an analog representation of, say, distance or intensity of an odor and an analog representation of probabilities, in the sense that you might think probabilities aren't out there in the world. They're not like, yeah, the intensity of an odor is out there in the world, but the probability that something is poisonous is not out there in the world. It's not a physical quantity in the environment. It's an abstract set of numbers, you might think. And so it seems like the models have to give some other explanation of why, of how probabilities are represented. There's going to be this dissimilarity between the usual case of magnitudes and the case of probability. All right, I don't have time to tell you more about this, but I want to conclude by thanking you again and by thanking Jeff Lee, who is pictured here on our deck in San Francisco. And thank you very much.
Thank you for that great talk. Okay, so now we'll have comments from Frank Tong, who is a professor at Vanderbilt. All right,
Great.
take it away.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks to the organizers, Kevin and Chaz. Thank you, Nico, for that illuminating talk. I am going to describe sort of my view of the role of Bayesian probabilities in perception. I'm not a proponent of the theory in the sense that I never published any papers on it, but I'm happy to sort of comment on it and sort of give you my thoughts of where it stands. So one of the points that Nico raises is perception inferential and underdetermined, or have vision scientists overstated their case? I actually think vision is immensely ambiguous and it's always performing inference. All of perception is an inference. And Humboldt emphasized this with his notion of unconscious inference. And I'm just going to give you a few flavors that usually think of vision as fast and accurate, just name what you see as fast as you can. You guys are slow today. Okay. Try this.
Tiger.
Okay, that was better. All right, what's the animal in this?
Giraffe.
How many people found the giraffe? All right, there's the giraffe. All right, so usually it's effortless, but sometimes not. And our visual systems are very good, but it's not perfect, and tasks can be easy or hard. But to really get a sense of how vision is difficult, this is an image from a textbook chapter I wrote, a grad level chapter. If anyone's interested, it's called Foundations of Vision from 2018. If I display pixels as the light intensity values as values from 0 to 9 in this digitized form, this is unrecognizable for you. Maybe you could go home, write some computer code and figure out what it is, but this is the image. If I convert it to this, it's instantly accessible. But that's because your brain is doing the inference problem of, given this matrix of light intensity values, what on earth could this possibly be? And your brain figures this stuff out immensely well. You might recognize his face. It might even be a face that you might recognize. It might be somebody that you consider voting for, or not. So this states to that leads to the inverse optics problem. This is just one way in which vision is ambiguous in very many ways. But given the retinal or proximal stimulus, what's out there in the world, I might ask you what you see and what sort of form. You probably think this is sticking up and this is lying on the ground. However, that's not the case, because really it is an impossible triangle existing in the real world. But actually, it's not an impossible triangle in the real world. You just have an accidental viewpoint. It's very unlikely that you just happen in this view where it forms this junction and you have this perceptual illusion. But you can create impossible figures in the real world if you have these special accidental viewpoints. Now, your brain's not making a stupid assumption, it's making a simplifying assumption. And yeah, I'm going to skip this part. So I'm going to give you just a few more quick illusions. What color do you see this square over here in the middle?
Brown.
Okay, and this one over here?
Orange.
All right, and we're all agreed. Okay, so if I told you the same, you'd say, Professor Tong, you're on drugs. I'd say, yes, I am, but that's not the point. So you can see here that they're all both brown. Hold on to that brown with all your cognitive power. They're still brown. They're both the same color, the same color, the same color. They're still the same color, right? No. You guys weren't trying hard enough. Okay, so we do that again, and okay, and you get the idea. So these types of illusions, we sometimes refer to them as cognitively, impenetrable. We can't easily modify them. For me, this image really did break the internet. For me, it had vision scientists debating for like long tirades on CVNet. Just raise your hand. How many people here are blue-black? Raise your hands. Raise your hands. All right. How many here are yellow-white? Okay. Yeah. So my wife is blue-black and I'm yellow-gold, and that's why we argue about everything. So here you can see what underlies this illusion. Out of curiosity, so for the people who see this as blue-black, do you see this as being out in the light or in the shadow? In the shadow. So for me, I'm yellow-gold, and I see this as being in the in the, well, I'm gonna get this backwards, in the shadow. And maybe for you to see it as blue-black, you see it as being in the light. And just to kind of convey or illustrate that a little better, this might help you see it the other way. I can only see it as yellow-gold, except in renditions like this. So this just goes to show that it's underdetermined what the lighting conditions are, so the illusion can go one way or another with the dress. So the notion of Bayesian inference is that, what is the stimulus out there given the sensory data? It's the probability of the data given the stimulus times the probability of the stimulus, and this can include contextual effects, like am I seeing this dress in the light or in the dark? So our brain is always computing things probabilistically. Now, I agree with Nico's point that there's a gap between probabilistic population codes and explaining illusions like this. Those models don't actually try to do that, but they're trying to make us a small step forward with that. So one of the key things or insights I feel that population coding models provided was this curious phenomenon. So neurons have Poisson-like firing rates. So what does Poisson mean? It means that if I had a bag of uranium here, and I don't know what the rate of emissions is, but let's say on average in a minute, you get like, 10 emissions of these radioactive particles, 10 radioactive events. Sometimes it would be a little bit more, 12, sometimes it'd be 9. The variance would, 2 minutes, okay. The variance would increase with the mean. And that seems weird that neurons would be noisy. Why would our brains be noisy? Why would that be a desirable thing? What it means that every spike that a neuron emits provides an extra bit of information that's independent of its past. And that's incredibly powerful. I don't think that happened by accident, that neurons are Poisson-like. And when you expand on this idea, what Alex Bouget and others, Ernst and Banks, came to realize that if you have a bank of neurons, let's say a bank of neurons between 2 different orientations, and they fire a certain amount, you can pull that information, or you can pull information, let's say separately from audition and vision, and obtain an estimate. And by adding the activity of different neurons, either multisensory or within a sensory modality, you are in a sense combining or multiplying probabilities. So through neurons synapsing onto another, you can achieve a form of computation that is akin to probability multiplication, which is really what you want to do. You want to combine the different likelihoods. And to me, I think that's brilliant. This is a graph that I made. I think I made this graph maybe about 10 years ago. This is me implementing a population coding model. There are, in this model, I think 36 orientation tuned units with a standard. Each one has a standard deviation of 15 degrees. And this illustrates, say, the firing of this neuron and how much it might tend to fire on different trials. These are the dots above it and how much it's firing. And so let's say if on a given trial, this is the number of spikes emitted by this population of neurons. It creates this shaggy, uneven landscape. You say, how can you possibly get a smooth estimate out of this? You can combine the information from all these neurons using, say, a maximum likelihood estimator. And black shows the true orientation, red shows the maximum likelihood orientation. And then I went ahead and said, well, let's just do vector sum and see how it does. Of course, that assumes that you're evenly sampling the space, but vector sum is green, and the amount of additional error with vector sum is actually very small. So it might not be that our brain performed maximum likelihood estimation per se, but just vector sum alone can get you a long way to making very good and very close to approximating multiplying probabilities and getting very good estimates of what the world may be like. And just to quote 1 or 2 things from Nico's paper that I'm going to push back a little bit on. Modelers can certainly understand the function of the perceptual system in terms of probabilities encoded by neural activation patterns. They can perform mathematical operations like a multiplication division, but the modelers do is not what the system's model. This would otherwise be analogous to mistaken thinking that because we can do some advanced math to describe planetary orbits, planets themselves are doing math. Now, I take issue with this because I believe neurons are doing computations. In fact, they are the first, and as far as I know, the first and only things that could do computations until we with neurons could build calculators and computers. I don't know any other evidence of computation being performed in the universe. If you know, tell me and show me where those aliens are. And so in this case, we could interpret the system. All right, so I related to the first argument too. It reminds me of sort of the argument, John Searle once argued simulated cow can't make real milk, but neurons, I believe, can do real computations. That's my view. So do we have access to just the point estimate of the population code or to the uncertainty as well? This is some data just from my lab on a working memory task where they see oriented grading, and depending, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 6, and depending on how many you have to hold, and then you have estimates of confidence. And you can rate your confidence, and this is the precision with which you can report that orientation. And you see this, massive effect of confidence. So you do have readout to your own uncertainty. This is work from Megan Peters and Hop Wan Lau, and this earlier paper talked about how there might be a type 2 form of signal detection, which is sort of your metacognitive sensitivity. And it's basically very related to your type 1 sensitivity. One other point, so it's still the case that conscious experience often feels like a point estimate. If you look at these bistable stimuli, if I break green glass, I give this to you, you can experience binocular rivalry and see either a face or a house, but not both. If you view this Knizia figure, you might sometimes see the square in front, in which case this region might seem blue. We might have periods where the square looks behind, in which case the blueness disappears. So it does, on the other hand, strangely with these bistable images, seem like we just experienced the point estimate of what our brains are estimating. And so there's this conundrum or this tension between our sensitivity and ability to read out the uncertainty in our brains and the fact that perception for the most part feels like a point estimate. And that's still to be resolved. Finally, I'm just going to say the big question is how the brain reads out perceptual interpretations. And to me, I believe this is likely related to conscious experience. I'm a proponent of the idea that I'm aware of my time, of interactive models of visual awareness where there's sort of recurrent loops of activity. And I don't know for sure, I'm still agnostic on this, but I believe that this could be related to predictive coding theory, that we have top-down feedback that tries to predict the sensory inputs. And that's, I think, the closest we get to ground truth. If we can't predict, let's say, the pattern of inputs in V1, and then we're not confident that we actually understand the scene. We don't have a top-down understanding of the scene. And maybe that's when we have large errors. I don't know, but that's sort of the theory or hypothesis. And I'll pause with that and end with that and leave you this.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. We do have time for one or maybe two quick questions. Yes, in front. Yeah.
Thanks for that, both those. I'm trying to figure out how to ask this politely. Not to the speakers, but to the whole room, which is, so if we, this question, I think it's a worthy question and it's cool to look at that and that's good. But seems that so many in the field have forgotten that we require, well, let's put it this way. We don't know what the code is, right? So we see these things are poisson, but nobody has any idea what the code is. And then imagine that it could be something as complex as the language of thought. If it is as complex as a language of thought, which many people, some people, very cool people have said that it needs to be that complex, then looking at these systems, even population codes, as involving a kind of implementation of a Bayesian inference will vastly underestimate the complexity of the system that's required to represent the visual world or inferences or what have you. So because the Bayesian inference is pretty low on the level of complexity, it's a pretty low level computational machine compared to, say, a symbolic language of thought with an internal grammar. So does that ever give you pause when you think about these things, that maybe you need to be thinking about a richer codec and a richer set of operations?
Yeah, so the reason why I often feel like the language of thought might be a good hypothesis for other purposes, but the reason why I tend to not talk about it in the case of the perceptual system is that I'm not quite convinced by the argument for the language of thought in perception. So it strikes me that there are powerful arguments for the language of thoughts when it comes to language acquisition or language comprehension or language production, but they don't transfer so well to the perceptual domain. So for example, I do not think that systematicity applies in the same way in the linguistic domain and in the perceptual one. So in the perceptual one, I do think that models that try to understand the perceptual system using analog quantities that don't have a syntax like language are quite plausible. That's the short answer, but thank you for the question.
I think that we're actually, as a field, moving really far forward in terms of understanding complexity and complex perceptions. Maybe not everyone here likes deep neural networks, but I think it's impressive what they can do. They're certainly not computing things in a totally Bayesian way, but it shows that things, very complex attributes are computable in a way that we didn't know how. And so the fact that we're starting to unlock those mysteries, I think, is huge. Maybe one day there will be a Poisson version of a neural network. We might find that we don't need to do it. Brains will do it with Poisson-like processes, and neural networks will use it with either deterministic or Gaussian noise. But I think in the end, it doesn't matter. I think we're moving forward.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you to both of our speakers. We have one more set of talks for you folks. So next we'll bring up Mohan Mathan, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. I'll get your slides. Oh. You want to just grab it.
This is working this fast.
Should work, yeah.
They're problematic. Yeah. I want to talk to you about.
Sorry. Okay, here we go.
Okay, thanks. So let's have a short, low IQ interlude in this. So the basic idea that I want to present is quite simple, really. And it's contained in that title, that the material objects are the only singular subjects of multimodal perception. So each modality presents a range of features. So some of these are multimodal, those are the ones that are italicized, but vision, color is peculiar to vision, texture, this kind of texture anyway, is peculiar to touch, and so on. Pitch and volume, timbre, music, etc., are peculiar to audition. But there's also in perception a certain structure. And if there wasn't any structure, you wouldn't be able to tell where the difference between two different occurrences of, let's say, red. So there are many occurrences of red there, and you can tell that there are many because you can tell that they're differently located. But location is a minimal subject for perceptual features. There are, it's generally insufficient for the perception of motion, for instance. So in motion, you see something moving from the left of your screen to the right of your screen, or the left of your field to the right of your field. And that doesn't give you just that different locations are lit up in succession. Rather, there's a single object which is moving from left to right. So location is not sufficient as a subject for all purposes. Most often, features are perceived as belonging to or as coming from material objects. And that's the notion that I want to say a little bit more about. So what is a material object? So a material object is a continuous body of matter that acts and responds as a unit because of internal causal connections. So I want to say it's causally cohesive, and so it responds as a unit and also acts as a unit. So rigid solids are material objects, and they're the ones that are most often studied, I think, in perception, vision science types of experiments. But animals are material objects too, and they are not rigid. They change shape all the time, but do so in a coherent way. The dog wagging its tail will also wag its head in so doing. And that's part of how you know that it's a single material object. Fluids, so liquids and gases are not material objects, generally speaking, but sometimes when they can appear to be, if they're unusually motionless. But generally speaking, a body of liquid has its properties not as a whole, but inherits the properties that it has from the properties of its parts. So a material object is a spatially contiguous, causally cohesive, mostly solid body of matter. So material objects in the modalities, objects in vision have been studied quite a lot, but they're more complex than traditional Gestalt perception would lead you to believe. Sounds are perceived as coming from objects, but sounds themselves are not material objects. Tactile properties are bound to material objects. So this mic in my hand feels like a single material object that in part has to do with the way it has input from my hands on both sides, and those get feedback from each other. Smells are object-based when integrated with kinesthesia. So I can bring a glass of wine to my nose, and it's the substance that's in the glass that I am smelling. And flavor is bound to the object in your mouth through touch. So some of this is multimodal, as you can see, but all of it has a binding to a material object. So there's a tendency among analytic philosophers, and dare I say it, among some vision scientists, to suggest that what we perceive are not material objects, but receptoral images. So the world impacts our retinas, the world impacts our cochlea, and so on. And the idea is that what we see or hear is the activation of these receptoral fields. So traditional empiricism says that since this is the sum total of information we get from the environment, and because it's the sum total of information we get from the environment, that's strictly speaking what we perceive. Everything else is constructed. So some people have made quite a lot out of that. But Donald Hoffman, for example, based on this kind of division between what you get on the receptors and what you construct. And he says that what you construct is, as he puts it, fictional. But it is based on that kind of distinction between what you get on the receptors and what the perceptual system is. So the question is why, what's a good occasion for saying that something more or distal from the receptors is what you perceive? So consider a scene like this, a single noisemaker in a big hubbub. So in this case, a singer in a street scene, she's singing, there's an audience, there's a lot of hubbub from other parts of the street, and you're walking past, let's say, at the back of the crowd. And so what you get is a number of different objects. Each one of those objects is exciting each one of the hair cells that go from your cochlea. So each hair cell reflects not just one object, but many objects, the sum total of their effect on the receptor. So what does it mean to say that you perceive a single distal object? What it means is that in that hubbub, and a changing hubbub as you walk past, you can nevertheless hear the singer as a distinct part of your auditory perception. So you're constantly aware of this one voice amidst the changing other sound. And that's quite a familiar phenomenon. I think that a number of people, it's also the same thing is true, as we'll see in a moment, in smell. So many different objects can affect the multiple olfactory receptors that you have. They each make a contribution to each one of those receptors, yet you can separate the smell of coffee from the smell of burning butter, let's say, in your kitchen. So you hear the voice, but there's no one cochlear pattern throughout. The notes are different, the volume is different, the direction is different, the background noises are different. Your auditory system extracts this one thing, or many one things, many single things from the hubbub. That's what we mean when we say that we hear the singer or her voice, not what's going on at the receptoral level. So this kind of constancy holds for sounds, anything that smells, flavors, anything that a single modality extracts from melange stimulation. But in the case of vision, which is the primary modality for public or shared space, the prime subjects are material objects. They're not the only subjects, but the prime subjects are material objects. And I'll try to show why we shouldn't think of material objects as only subjects for vision, but also subjects for other modalities. So first, let me introduce this notion of amodal. No, I'm not introducing the notion of amodal. There is this notion of amodal completion, where there's a display, and there are parts of the display which are silent to vision, so to speak, invisible to vision. Nevertheless, something seems to be there. The something which seems to be there is visual. So it looks as if there's something invisible, or it looks as if there's something hidden from vision. I want to generalize that a bit. And by the way, this also holds for audition and for touch. There are lots of things in this solid object which feel as if they're not being felt. But I wanted a more generalized notion of completion, which is involved in perceiving material objects, and that is the notion of perceiving something that is not only unperceived by that modality, but perceiving something that's imperceptible in general. So I said earlier that a material object is causally cohesive. Causal cohesion is not something that you can either see or hear or touch. Nevertheless, you somehow complete the reception that you get from these modalities to provide some awareness, immediate awareness of something that's imperceptible. So just as amodal completion sounds paradoxical because it's seeing something that can't be seen, generalized completion is even more paradoxical because perceiving something that is in fact imperceptible. And the things that make up a material object are in fact imperceptible, or some of them are, because they involve things like causal cohesion. So generalized completion is for material objects. There are other things which are completed, as I said earlier, so sounds are completed, but in general, we don't attribute imperceptible properties to sounds. We don't say that the sound has a part which is imperceptible as opposed to not perceived. Okay, so multimodal completion of binding. So here's a sort of example that I have in mind. You're listening to an orchestra, and a flute melody enters. The flute melody is somewhere there in the orchestra, but you can't precisely locate where it is. You visually scan the players, and you see among the group one individual whose bodily motions mimic the sound. Then suddenly the sound gets precisely located. So vision has contributed to the sound is multimodally bound to a visible material object. So here, generalized completion is binding sound to an object, which normally sound is not seen as in one modality bound to an object. So usually you hear the sound as coming from, as opposed to attributed to that material object. So subjects for material multimodal bindings are the material objects, as I said, various combinations of modalities noted earlier, and experiences in one modality bound to material objects, courtesy of constancies underlying variations in another. Okay, let's take smell in particular as an interesting example because it turns out that smell has to be pre-organized for this particular purpose. So it's generally been said that smell is not, does not have any spatial representation. So Claire Batty, who is known in, is generally referred to in philosophy as the smell lady. She says, everyday olfactory experiences do not possess robust spatial representation. As a result, do not allow us to single out particular objects in our environment. And I myself earlier wrote that you can smell things as here, and that's as much spatial representation as you can get in smell. But what I would claim is that when you sniff an aromatic object, the everyday olfactory experience that Claire talks about is multimodally bound to an object. So let me skip this. Suppose, imagine yourself searching for something, for the bad smell in your refrigerator. You have to bring there are many smells there, and you have to bring various different objects out of the refrigerator to locate the smell of them. When you bring them out of the refrigerator, there's an olfactory gradient. There's what Tyler Birch called homing or beaconing. Out of nervousness, I went over that slide rather quickly, but Birch talked about homing and beaconing as the only way that you can get any kind of spatial representation in smell. But consider what you have to have in order to have beaconing. There's a bunch, as I said, there's a bunch of things in the refrigerator. All of them are contributing to your olfactory receptors. Because all of them are contributing to your olfactory receptors, each one of the receptors is reflecting a sum total of a number of different smells or different substances. So, or odorants. So in order to have homing or beaconing in the way that there is in the location of a single smell in your refrigerator, you need to separate out a profile. So I said earlier that you can smell coffee as well as burning butter in your kitchen. And you can, but that requires you to not just to have one olfactory receptor separate from the other, but a whole olfactory profile, separated out and extracted, just as in the case of the singer in the crowd. Okay, so but that means that smell itself is so organized that it is able to separate material object types or material object types from a whole smell scenario. So when spatial perception is deficient, multimodal binding is assisted by object profiles. So smell, there's less spatial representation in smell, but there is an object profile that's assisting it. So let me quickly talk about a few other types of subjects. There's, I spoke a little bit about fluids, but these objects are not experienced as material objects. They're experienced rather as sums of parts. They're ephemera, the shadows, beams of light, darkness. And again, they're not experienced in general as single objects that make the sound or which are causally coherent. So conclusion and takeaway, material objects are the unique loci for multimodal binding. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And so now to round out the end of the session, we will have Viola Stormer, who is going to give comments. And Viola is an assistant professor of psychology at Dartmouth. Oh. Right. Why don't you?
All right, well, first of all, thank you also to Kevin and Tess for inviting me and organizing this interesting event. Okay, so I'm gonna comment on the interesting talk that we just heard on the paper, and with the really focusing on the question whether objects or thinking as object as being multisensory. And I'm going to start by trying to kind of recap what kind of the main points that I read in the paper and that I heard at the talk. And I'm going to first start with just kind of basically the definition that one gives of material objects, and kind of try to recap or reword them in the words that we all use, I think, in vision science. Right, so one very important cue kind of for us to think about things in the world is that they have this cue of spatiotemporal continuity, so things that move together at the same time, we conceive of as objects. And then I think the kind of addition that Mohan has in his paper is that, in particular for non-rigid objects, so for example, animate objects like the dog, there's also some causality in how the parts of the object move together. And how I kind of made sense of this causal part was thinking really about that basically what we must have in our minds is some like intuitive theories about how animals move in the world and which parts can move consistently together to still kind of create objects. And so that part is maybe kind of learned, but just kind of haven't seen many objects moving that way. But then maybe the critical part that I want to focus on mostly is the question about multisensory integration. So our other parts of objects, so for example, the sounds integrated in the same ways as other visual parts. And so this is this idea of generalized completion. So the main idea or the main argument here that material objects are not just visual, but that other sensory inputs such as sound and touch and smell and taste are also part of the object. So when we feel the teddy bear, the softness of the teddy bear, we immediately kind of attract or kind of attribute to the visual object that we're seeing. When we smell coffee or put the coffee mug close to our face, we kind of attribute the smell to the coffee, to the mug that we're holding in our hands. And so I'm going to generally argue or mostly agree with this assessment that objects are or can be multisensory. But I also have a few questions, basically to Mohan or thoughts on things that I think would be worth considering and thinking about how multisensory integration might work. And so what I'm going to do is kind of first start with just asking kind of from our vision science point of view, what is a visual object? Then ask what are the principles of multisensory integration? What is evidence from neuroscience that we can use to kind of figure out whether multisensory integration or integration across modalities works similar or different from integration within a modality? And then kind of in the third part, think about how that integration might kind of differ across and within modalities. Okay. So why is this important to us here at ESS? Of course, we think about objects all the time, about in particular what types of stimuli we are using for our experiments and whether those are objects that we're studying. So that's of course evident in object recognition, but also kind of how cognitive functions operate on different objects, right? So how attention operates on different types of stimuli or memory and so on. And so I think Mohan really just talks about mostly realistic objects in the paper, right? And often we use these really simplified objects in our tasks and our studies, which are very useful, which let us maybe get in particular mechanisms. But of course, it's important to kind of scale up and really understand how many cognitive processes operate on more realistic objects. So we kind of think about maybe scaling up to not much more complex visual objects, but even objects that kind of possess different types of multisensory features, right? So dogs that bark and teddy bears that feel soft, and kind of the coffee that also has the smell. And so kind of scaling up and thinking maybe about kind of that those types of other senses also influence our visual perception and visual objects seems important. So I think that's kind of like one point that we take from this paper that maybe we can think about as vision scientists. Okay, so what is a visual object? I'm going to focus here on the main cue, I think, that I think at least about when I think about what is a visual object, which is spatial temporal continuity. There's tons of evidence that many of you will know, right? So we know that infants use spatial temporal information to infer objects, right? So when they see a bar moving behind an occluder, and they see kind of a two-part object afterwards, they react surprised compared to when they see a continuous object, kind of telling us that already 4 months infants really use these spatial temporal continuity cues to infer objecthood. That links very strongly to these theories of object piles and visual indexing, right, where we know that spatial temporal factors are kind of the most critical, really, that help us kind of link different features to objects that kind of have the spatial continuity. And those are also the properties of objects that are most robustly represented compared to other visual features. Okay, so now we can see if the same principle applies to multisensory integration. And it turns out it does. It's a short version here. So there's a lot of neuroscience evidence that when we look at kind of response of multisensory neurons, like really low-level multisensory neurons, that they care exactly about the same properties, such as temporal congruency and spatial congruency, and also inverse effectiveness. And I'll get to the third point in a little bit again. But if we're presenting a visual stimulus and a sound stimulus at the same location, at the same point in time, those two stimuli will get integrated. Multisensory neurons will start caring about it. So that sounds really, really similar in terms of kind of the main principles of integrating different features into a coherent object, as we know from vision. So maybe those are not that different. But I think one really important thing to consider here is that what those integration windows are, especially across modalities, is going to differ quite dramatically, like what kind of stimuli we're looking at. So this is a really simplified version here that I drew on, right? A little, just like kind of a flash of a star and a beep sound potentially being integrated. But of course, we want to again try to think about scaling this out to these more realistic objects. And so these integration windows in terms of time and space, we know that they vary dramatically depending on what types of stimuli we're looking at. So for real world objects, these integration windows might be much larger, kind of the largest one probably in terms of speech, that if we attribute this, the speech of somebody to kind of the person that's speaking, it can be up to like half a second basically of time, and we're still going to attribute kind of the sound of the voice to that person. So these integration windows will be maybe more flexible than just within a single modality, I think, for certain objects. And then also they're going to differ, of course, across the different types of senses. So for example, for smell, where we don't have so clear location information, they might be even a little bit more fuzzy or more broad. So that's something I think to keep in mind, to really think about kind of this binding the different parts to an object might be different depending on the types of stimuli. Okay. So as a kind of the question, I guess, that I had when reading the paper was that it sounded to me like really this multimodal integration was mostly thought of as like all these inputs that we're getting, they're like reliable and they're clear. So we're seeing a car and hearing the sound of the car and we can integrate those two. But I think something that's really important to keep in mind when we think about multisensory integration in particular, that integration is going to be highly driven and dependent on the strength and the reliability of the individual senses. So that's this principle of inverse effectiveness. So basically get more multisensory integration if both stimuli are really faint and noisy. So if we don't see the object clearly and don't hear it clearly, the integration is going to be stronger. That's kind of that one principle that we want to really address, and I'm curious to hear more about that. And I think the second one is that how the integration works is also going to depend on the reliability of these cues, of these inputs. So if one input is particularly weak and unreliable, we might be relying more on the other input. So let me demo this here with a cool demo from my grad student, Jamal Williams. So if I show you this video here, you might be guessing, right, the idea is here that the object is kind of hard to see, it's small, it's in the distance, like what type of object are you actually seeing when you're looking at this? If you hear this additional sound, what? Oh my God. We tested this.
Try it.
Maybe you're biased to now see that this is actually a seagull, right? But if you hear this sound, what you might be actually doing is now kind of extracting more drone-like features and actually kind of attribute now this sound to the image and actually basically think that this is a drone, right? So that's just one demonstration, and there's lots of empirical evidence really showing that we're basically weighting these different cues, these different inputs according to their reliability. And so I think this is the second point that's very different from just integration within a modality, right? That we kind of can weight these different inputs because they're independent, right? So one input might be really strong and reliable, and so we can kind of rely on the other sensory signal to really basically help our perception. And okay, so to wrap up here, I think the general point of that multimodal objects exist and we attribute kind of these different sensory inputs to the object, I agree with, but I think they're context dependent, which is, and that's what I call it here very broadly, right? So the spatial temporal integration window will differ within across modalities and the types of stream that we're looking at, and also the integration will depend on the reliability of the input. And yeah, I think that's it.
So we have time for maybe one quick question for these two speakers, and then we'll go to a little bit of a general discussion. And I'll just point out that we're going to end formally at 5:30 because I know people have places to be, but we will all stick around and then we will all migrate to those tables that were mentioned that have wine on them. So yes.
Thanks, guys. That was great. Just a very quick question. I guess really to Mohan. Part of it was what about events? Aren't there multimodal effects where there's temporal spatial congruities between, flash and a sound, but the other had, for example, with exactly that, but it's not clear there's a material object involved. The other small thing was just coffee, it's not a liquid. And so isn't the binding there to a liquid? So again, not to a material object in the sense that you define.
Oh, yeah, to take the second part of your question, there's no particular binding to a cup of coffee, I would say. I mean, you smell coffee, but that you don't smell a cup of coffee, right? I mean, or smelling a cup of coffee is no different from smelling a carafe of coffee or something. Or if you have good.
That.
Oh, I see. When you sniff it, when you bring it up to your nose, that's
just the portion of liquid, the thing.
Yeah, so there is confined by a solid.
So the claim is that there needs to be a material object in play.
Yeah, but as to your first question, that's more difficult, and maybe therefore Viola should answer it. So the flash bounce effect is to an event, and is that a multimodal site of finding that is a question, and maybe it is.
Maybe one more quick one. Yes, just yell.
I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so I think this is really cool, right? So, the kind of currency here seems to be of object representations, right? Like that's where you kind of bind all this together. You can maybe find like a kind of neural correlate of this somewhere, let's say in your anterior lobe. But we don't just have sensory information about objects, right? Like we have propositional knowledge about things about dogs. Like, we know dogs woof. We know that dogs are related to other animals. How do you think these kinds of knowledge play into these kinds of effects of completion and these effects of binding? Like what's the role of other kinds of knowledge in kinds of sensory related tasks?
So I would suggest that animals have object perception of the sort that I'm thinking about, and that it's unlikely they do it by conceptual learning. I don't want to deny that they do it by some other kind of learning, right? By associative learning or other forms. But also, that's the first point that I make. The second point that I'd make is that there seems to be something, I really hesitate to use a word like innate, but I'm going to use it just for a shorthand, that there's certain principles of binding which go with material objects, which could have easily gone another way if there was absolutely no bias towards causally coherent things. And so I mean, the two questions, I guess, one is there some learning involved? In other words, is there something extra perceptual involved? And I think maybe there is. But the other thing is that extra perceptual thing conceptual? There, I would hesitate.
I can add maybe one. Yeah, I think in these particular like real world scenarios where like binding the bark to the dog and so on, I would say that it's probably learned just based on like statistical regularities in your mind, right? That you learn like respect to exposure. Sure, like the bark and the dog, like that belongs to a dog and so on. And so that's why I can do these types of bindings, right? So I would probably say it is learned within your lifetime. And those
so I don't want
knowledge
to
is really important, right? To actually get this
microphone.
Okay, well, I think that that's, oh, okay. I think that's the time that we have for this Q&A. Can we thank all of our speakers? So now we want to move to a more general discussion. So if people need to go, then great, but otherwise maybe we'll drag some chairs up to the front and we can have a more general discussion. And while we're doing that, I just wanted to point out a very nice synergy, especially between the last two sets of talks. We've got this representation of probability and reliability, and we get into these statistical regularities of environment. So maybe we can start by talking a little bit about that. Sorry, I know that everyone, don't go, stay for the discussion. Stay. Yeah, let's grab some chairs. Let's do the discussion. Let's do it. Let's go. Let's go. Let's do it. I don't know what I would. Yeah. All right. One other link. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And so how that plays into the fact that state also has to be Great. All right, I don't know. Speakers, please. Not so well said, but yeah. Okay, great. Got it. All right. So yeah, so we can kind of have this be a little more free flowing. There's fewer of us here. We can kind of crowd in a little bit. So there might be some lingering questions that people had. And so, yeah, please, Aaron.
Yeah,
you want a microphone?
Do I need one? So yes, the question is, I guess, the possibility of competing representation. So a lot of the talks have been talking about, there's a representation of an object, there's a representation of a number, et cetera, and so on. But what we know, going back to the original example that was given when it talks about motion, is that not only do we have multiple systems that represent motion, we can actually see multiple motion directions of the same object at the same time. So for instance, here's an example where you'll see reverse fly motion at the same time as object motion moves in different directions. Going to number representation, we could have a concept of a number at the same time as a perception of magnitude. And so one thing that neuroscience looks at quite a bit is trying to understand what are these different levels of representation and how they come together. And that's something that I did not see discussed quite as much in these presentations, but I'm curious your thoughts.
You guys are the experts. Yeah, for everyone. How would you like to respond?
No, that's a fair point. So, so let me understand if this is a difficulty or just something that needs to be built in at a later stage. What do you think?
It needs to be addressed because it's a property of the system that we're discussing.
It's a property of the system that we're discussing that, for instance, with, let's do numbers since it's not my example. There's magnitude representation as well as numerical representation. Those are two different levels because one has to be extracted in a different way from the display than the other. So let's say that's exactly correct and an important crucial problem. Do you think that in principle it makes a difficulty for Sam, or
makes it difficult with sound?
For Sam, sorry. He was the one who was talking about numbers.
Well, it's a nuance that I think in some ways could simplify the conversation or make it more complicated. Because the thing is that a lot of the debate seems to be that you have, this view or that view. But the thing is that, if you're able to both have a representation of magnitudes
and a representation of numbers, and they have different properties. And that depending upon the task that the individual is doing, or the moment that they're doing it, that they could rely more on one or the other, combine them in different ways. This seems to be like our understood property of how humans or other animals navigate the world. And I think that there are some simplifications in some of the presentations that I think provide challenges that might not fully exist.
I guess I was just going to say in the case of number, I mean, I don't think the approximate number system is like all there is to numerical notation. So, I'm just trying to characterize one specific psychological mechanism. Yeah, I guess that, it's going to come up with the response for Stella. Like, I think it's an interesting question, how the perception of number relates to other magnitudes. But I certainly don't think that the approximate number system is like conceptual knowledge of number, like a big flex number. Just, have very signature limits. There's, they conflict with one another. They're just ultimately different processes. Yeah.
Sure.
Absolutely. I'm not gonna talk about numbers, so.
Okay, so I'll stay on the number thread. I completely agree, right? So I think there's little debate that we, at least in the number case, can represent number as well as other non-numerical magnitudes. Proponents of the orthodox view would not say we're only encoding number. We can encode the area of the objects, their densities, the convex hull, and so on. I think the question then becomes, which I think you're getting at, is how do we negotiate, right, between these different representations, and what does that mean? So one way, I think, among the sort of proponents of the orthodox view would be, you've got these independent representations in perception, one for number, one for these other magnitudes. If we do need to integrate them at some point, right, maybe it makes sense at some point, you want the biggest food object that sums up the most mass. The idea there would be that that integration is happening post-perception, right? When you need to make a decision about whether to weight one more than the other or to take them all together. At least the position I was arguing for is that those different magnitudes that happen to co-occur in the stimulus input remain integrated while you process in perception. When you do need to make a decision about using one or the other, that's the case where you have to maybe use your attention to decide which one is more relevant and pull them apart. So rather than pulling them apart early in perception, at least I might suggest that it's being pulled apart later. But that's, at least those are two different ways, I think, to think about how to do that different level, the different levels of processing and what it might mean.
Just because we're on number, I guess I should say something. So one way some folks have thought about this issue about multiple representations, or let's say co-referential representations. So they're picking out something like the same objects, like say approximately 7 and exactly 7 are both trying to talk about 7 in some way, is to say, well, the objects in the world that we desire to represent, they're richer than any of our representational systems or vocabularies. And so having multiple representations is a way of having multiple lenses on a higher dimensional problem. And this goes for multimodal representation as well, that even our multimodal representations drastically underdetermine the things that we actually want to be thinking about in the world. And the next thing is that, so if you think about, Sam mentioned Susan Carey's book, Origin of Concepts. In that book, Susan's argument is basically taking several cases, number is one of them, and showing that we do begin with multiple representations that are relevant to that space, that conceptual space, be it cause, number, object, etc. And it's through a kind of hypothesis testing that we combine across them because they do pick up on different aspects of those external objects. And so we do some kind of hypothesis generation and then testing to come up with a deeper insight about those objects, and that is where actually we get, say, cardinality from and the successive principle. But those are hard won, and won by combining across.
I guess this is just, yeah, I mean, just because I didn't really get a chance to sort of respond to Stella, and I think this is kind of related to this. You know, I guess I don't really have like a strong stance on exactly how the approximate number system relates to the perception of order magnitudes. I think there are some studies which are pretty hard to tell in terms of this kind of integrated story. So like the dumbbell effects that I talked about, those were at least standardly taken to suggest that there's a kind of normalization phase where like items are individuated according to some principles, independently of the confounding variables and then tallied up. I think that some of the studies that Stella pointed to point to a more indirect model where you know, things like surface area playing a much more central role in number estimation. And you know, I mean, in a sense, I don't think this should be that surprising. Like, you know, you think like depth perception, there's just lots and lots of different mechanisms for extracting that. That being said, I think the devil's in the details, and we probably, you know, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I've talked to Stella for a long time, but for integral dimensions, and I would like to do that. But
I mean, I think those dumbbell effects are awesome, and I agree that they show that numbers are a real thing that you're getting from the objects. I don't think they suggest, so in other words, that number isn't computed simply by way of the area or the densities that are there. Because they don't seem to matter, right? You can hold the area constant and you see 4 objects in one case and 2 in another case, right, when you have the connection. I don't think it means that because you get 2 objects, there's no other non-numerical magnitude that's not being encoded with it. There has to be, right? We've still seen information about the size and the surface area of the objects. They just happen to be 4 small objects in one case and 2 bigger objects in another case.
I guess the cases where, you know, you have the 2 circles connected by a thin line effectively turning them into one object versus just a very small break. You know, all the non-numerical components look very, very similar. So it doesn't look like you could just be relying on like the total surface area of the collection plus density and then using some algorithm to thereby extract number. It looks like you're relying on the individuated objects being tracked.
Yeah. So I'm getting confused by this discussion. Because it seems to me that there are 2 different cases. I mean, the sort of case that Stella was talking about, as I understood it, was where there were 2 systems which were interfering with one another. And where the area magnitude, for example, was interfering with the numerical estimation. But there's another sort of case where there's both of them going on at the same time, but they're not interfering with one another. And I think that's a case where the 2 systems are being kept separate, and you're arguing for the existence of the 2 systems separately. At least that's how I understood it. Fans. So I don't think that the fact that there's interference tells against it, or just like I guess.
I don't know a lot about the number, but just hearing about the experiments today, it seemed to me that there were a couple different times or conditions in which things were observed. So like in the kids study where they were doing the multimodal comparisons, it's still I think within the subitizing limit of minds of their infant. I'm not sure animals would result in multimodal format. I know that experiment I'd be intrigued. Right? Okay, cool. The other one was the Frankenberry experiment. Was that with small numbers of items, and would that still hold? Like it's more textual. I wonder, like so like the effects of size and area and magnitude start to happen when it gets to be way beyond the subitizing number. So some effects may still
have influences, and it just kind of depends on the context in which the conditions are tested out, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in that Frank and Harry study, they were using numbers there. So this tripped up some of the commentators in their paper because they relied on bigger. But yeah.
Before we go to another comment, I just want to say that I feel like there's a meta level discussion that's evolving or emerging here, which is that it feels like there's a tension between what I think the empiricists like myself feel like maybe our experiments are actually saying, and then there's like this conceptual discussion or conceptual space that we really need to be paying a little bit more attention to. So in the spirit of this being phiVis, I just wanted to point out that feels like kind of a little bit of what's driving some of these tensions. So maybe that can also be a driving force of this discussion as well, which is like concretely. Can I give an example? So it just the way that the empiricists versus the philosophers tend to be arguing, like the reliance on kind of conceptual or thought experiments or logical progression through what it really means to discover or to observe some particular empirical effect versus here's a whole bunch of empirical evidence that I think is driving this effect. And so I don't have a more concrete example than that. It was just like, it feels like that's kind of a piece of what this discussion is. And so we're all in the same space here. And so I think we should take this opportunity to highlight that stuff.
Do you
Yeah.
think you mean experimentalist? Empiricist is a different.
Okay, experimentalist.
Is that what you
Sure.
mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
experimentalist. I'm not a philosopher. I just pretend to be one sometimes. So yes, experimentalists. Those of us who do the experiments and sometimes get very stuck in the data. Yeah, please.
So I think, I don't know, people hear me without a microphone?
Yeah, pull it down. Yeah.
So this is kind of following up on your comment, but I think one of the things that struck me about the last two talks was that the philosophers are thinking from the world in, and the psychologists, psychophysicists are thinking from the sensory data out. And so, you know, the contrast between, so when Mohan talks about walking through a space and listening for the sound source, and there's this long extended encounter with the scene, which allows you to isolate the covariance between the sound and the visual objects and kind of identify that variance over time. And all of our experiments are flashing two little stimuli and having people judge simultaneity, right? So, I mean, just because we find, or Frank's examples of you know, the accidental view, right? In some ways, I think reinforces the view that it's not inference all the time, right? That we ignore those cases, and making an assumption about an accidental view, that views are non-accidental, wouldn't help us. Sorry, opposite. Making the assumption that not all views are non-accidental wouldn't help us find the giraffe, right? It's an accidental alignment that is difficult to find. So my point here, I think, is that if our experiments were designed to actually provide the sources of information that Mohan was talking about, that are actually available in an extended exploration of trying to find the sources of the sounds and the sights and the smells, exploring the stuff in your refrigerator, I think we would not be that far apart. The data would not be that far apart from this phenomenology.
There's another hand behind. Yeah.
Well, this was sort of a comment that links maybe the first set of talks and the third set of talks. The third set of talks are really about defining objects, right? And the first set of talks, you guys were talking about counting them, right? And in the dumbbell experiments, yeah. What you have is related to, you know, this big literature on object definition, right? And when they get counted as the same object, they get maybe counted slightly a little bit less than one, right? So I guess my question for both of you is, both sets of you, is that do those fields link, right? That's one. And then two, if it's a case that we have somewhat separable, but not entirely separable systems that define objects and systems that count things, right? Are they the same systems? Are they 15 systems and 7 of them do both? Or, you know, what do you think is the way that would fall out?
You want to respond to that guy?
So I had the same thought when I was listening to Sam's talk that, so he said explicitly that when he said that numbers were higher order, what he meant was, I take it, that it was the number sense was preceded somehow by object, or well, not a material object, but some sort of objectification process, right? But so I agree with you. I had that puzzle myself when I was listening to this talk. So with that, you can answer the question.
Let's do this and then let's go over here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think in a lot of the kind of paradigm cases, it looks like in order to make sense of like the computational function of the approximate number system, we need to appeal to perceptual objects. And I think, we just don't really have a very good grasp of what they are. I mean, we can sort of like talk about stealthy objects and things like that, but that's probably just an approximation. There are lots of, if you really built like, a rule governed computer that just followed those principles, it would fail to track a lot of objects that are perceptual objects that seemingly we do in relevant ways. And I think in the number sense literature, that's also going to be quite clearly true. So I mean, I hope I'm remembering examples correctly in Stella's talk. I mean, some of the numerical quantities being tracked aren't really like objects in that sense. They're more like features of objects. Things like the number of points on a star and things like that. So there's going to be cases where okay, sorry, I'm misremembering this, but there's going to be like lots of cases where they're not stealthy objects that the approximate number system is tracking.
Just to keep the discussion going on this front, I actually think one of the empirical things we've learned about objects in all of these contexts is that they are highly abstract, far beyond what we typically call stealthy objects or what Mohan called material objects. So to take one example for, our field talked about object-based attention for a long time and used that word and helped itself to all of the sort of metaphysical assumptions of that word object. Then it turned out that you get all the same effects with groups, and you get all the same effects with parts. And I think what our field decided in general is that it wasn't very palatable on grounds of parsimony to say, aha, we've discovered a new mechanism of group-based attention and a new mechanism of part-based attention. Instead, we realized that the word object was poorly chosen, and that what this really is the visual system detects structure. Structure out in the environment, structure that's in space, structure that's in time, structure at all different spatial scales. And I wonder, this seems really central to what a lot of the talks were discussing. So like for Mohan, you talked about material objects, and you contrasted that very appropriately with like fluids and vapors. But what about with like a flock of insects, a swarm of insects, which you can track, you can hear the sound of that tracking, maybe you could smell them if they, I don't know if they're particularly smelly insect, but no one would say that that swarm is an object in the stealthy sense or in the material sense. So I feel like we have to abstract from that. All the dumbbell effects that you guys were talking about, you get in space and in time, for example. That's some of the work of Joan Chocolate who's sitting right there. But I also think like David Burr, who I think is here at VSS, but maybe not in this room, has shown that you get very early cross-modal spatiotopic adaptation to number across modalities. I think that shows that the representations have to be extremely abstract very early on. That makes it difficult to talk about any particular visual property or any material object. That was kind of a question. So the question is, Mohan, you're wrong to talk about material objects. It's more general than that.
That's still a statement.
What do you think about all that stuff?
Sure, let's do this and then we'll
I think your question is, why do you think that abstract entities are not picked up in perception?
I would say that they are being picked up in perception.
Right. So you're asking us, why do philosophers have an issue with thinking that abstract objects are?
I'm going to nod just because that sounds like a really good
So
question.
does it make sense? Does it make sense to say yes, flocks of birds are picked out, and some paths. I'm more a little bit more skeptical about paths. They are, but I kept saying mostly, normally, primary, dominantly, words of this kind. But let me try something much bolder, which I didn't want to try. Namely, could it be that flocks of birds are picked up because they have certain features which are almost like material objects? They remind you of material objects.
Take Ian's question from earlier though, which was about events.
Yeah,
It's
Ian's
almost
question,
like that,
yeah, I
but
put
it's
that.
still the same thing about structure.
Yeah, no, I think Ian's question was an important one, because I think that that's a straightforward difficulty for me. Flashback effect. Yeah, but flocks of birds are not quite as word.
I guess what do you mean by abstract, right? So there's a sense in which you could pull up a concept, or I'm not even gonna say concept at this point. You can have a representation of number that is completely amodal, right? That is independent of the sensory modality or the visual modality, right? Which is why you get sort of these cross adaptation effects. But I mean, the alternative is that some of these effects are still modality specific, for instance, right? And the kind of cross adaptation you get is I mean, maybe it's still in perception, but maybe it's slightly post perception, where it's.
So doesn't that suggest it's early? It's very spatially specific. And the pupil. And David's recent post of today, this morning.
It's in the pupil.
Yep.
That cuts across
Number.
and
Control and whatever, yeah.
auditory. Yeah, but I'm talking about the cross
Yeah, you
modal
could hear
effects,
it and
right?
see the pupil go. You could even have, say, imagine 20 versus imagine 5. And you would get a pupil change. But
Right.
right now they have it, even with the eyes closed, you get a pupil.
Okay, so but how abstract, okay, so you get number in the pupil, but you also get sort of, you can adapt to number and then show after effects on an individual object that varies in area, right? So
I agree with you, Stella.
well, you get that, right? But I guess what's the mechanism behind that, right? Do you now think that there's some sort of abstract magnitude perception that allows for that to cut across? Do you have something separate for number and area that is somehow being compared and allowing for the crosstalk? I mean, I think these are open questions. I don't have answers to them, but I would just point out that the effects that occur across sensory modalities for number are also occurring across magnitude representations, right? And so I don't think we can say, oh, the number's abstract because it cuts across sensory modality, but magnitude's not abstract, right? Even though it cuts across the two different arms. I feel that you can have it both ways. But I'm not saying you're trying to start.
All right, I'm gonna be terrible and I'm gonna say we have one quick comment. or
It's not quick, so we can
Okay,
skip
all
it.
right. So maybe one quick question from Zoom then to round us out, to remind us that we've got a large Zoom audience.
Yes, so there is a reply to Brian from Jake Beck, but maybe we want to talk about that at some point, or I can tell you what it says afterwards. But there is a question first from Jeremy Goodman, who's been waiting a while. And this is about material objects and what's represented. So he says, many philosophers think that wherever there is one material object, there are many, e.g. a statue is the same thing as the clay it's made of. Is this true about your notion of material object? If so, do you think we perceive each of the material objects that coincides with any material objects we perceive? And does perception ever attribute properties that apply to a material object without applying to every object coincident with it?
Okay, well, we're gonna be here for another 20 minutes.
Yeah.
This is the end, and then we'll head to the beach.
So is the question about overlapping material objects? Is that
Yeah, and whether you attribute like both of those, like whether you attribute like a property to one object that a coincident object doesn't have?
Yes or no?
I mean, I think one can distinguish coincident material objects.
So
How
yes.
you do it is a
yes.
different matter, but I guess.
Yes or no? So all right.
So,
So I'm sorry to cut off this really interesting discussion. I'm sorry to cut off the answer to this question I know there were a million more in the chat. I know everyone else has other questions as well. But we will continue this discussion on the beach, and I will hand the microphone back to our wonderful organizers for some final closing thoughts. And thank you to all of the speakers.
All right, we just wanted to thank Sam, Nico, Milan, Stella, Frank, and Viola for being part of this, Megan for being such a wonderful chair, Becky for helping out, and you all for sticking around and contributing to the discussion. Let's go get drinks on the beach.
You forgot someone to thank.
And Chad.
Thank you for thanking me, Kevin Matthew. Thank you for appointing me deputy sheriff of phiVis. And like Megan said, the discussion can continue. So in fact, I think I might be the only one who roughly knows where our tables are. So you can follow me, and I'll do some homing and beaconing, and you can follow me.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Could have gone for like 3 more hours there. Yeah.